Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my video talking about my science fiction recommendations. This is a specifically, if you love this project, book, or movie, then you should read this book or series. I have done this for the Star Wars books. I've talked about if you love this Star Wars movie, read this Star Wars book. If you like this Star Trek project, read. I've done that a little bit, but I thought I'd do that for Sci-Fi because I actually had a lot of ideas for some of the books I've read. Not all of these are favorite books of mine, although some of them are, but these are all specifically ones that I think will be curated to different likes and dislikes. So I think that this will work well. I think I'm right that if you like a certain thing, you will like this book that I'm going to recommend for it. So why don't we begin with the number 10 book on my list, which is If You Love Classic feeling sci-fi books. There was this kind of 70s and 80s feel of sci-fi books, and it may have gone a little bit into the 90s, but it's really that 70s and 80s sci-fi. It's that classic you feel about exploration, big battles, even though the books aren't necessarily that long. The covers are classic. You feel maybe a little bit of military sci-fi in there. That's the kind of classic 70s and 80s sci-fi that you're enjoying. Well, I'm going to recommend Timothy Zahn's Cobra series, specifically the first one, the Cobra novel. I think that this book perfectly encapsulates classic sci-fi storytelling, and I think if you enjoy that type of thing, this series as a whole, you will just eat up. My second recommendation, or I should say my recommendation, number 9 on my recommendations list, is if you enjoy episodic storytelling, where it feels like you're watching television, where each, chunk of the story is being told, and there's clear delineations, and you can tell that, and you can see how the story's slowly advancing while independent, adventures are happening in different places. If you like that kind of style of storytelling, which some people do, I'm going to recommend the book Overdraft, The Orion Offensive by John Jackson Miller. This is probably my least talked about John Jackson Miller book because it's his only novel that is not Star Trek or Star Wars, and it's his only prose, really, that has nothing to do with media tie-in fiction. This is just an original science fiction book. This book was released episodically, where he released it in chunks and then eventually published it as a whole back in 2013. So this book's 10 years old. That's crazy. I only read this a couple of years ago. I think it was like 2018 or 2019. I want to say 2019 when I read this. It's not my favorite of Miller's books, but it's really enjoyable. And the episodic nature does not work best for me, but if you're someone that you like that style of storytelling, this is really fun. This is a story where we're doing trade with aliens on different things, and this guy basically bankrupts this trading company, and so the trading company forces him to go on the front lines to start selling things to try to make up the money that he lost. And there's other characters involved that are just delightful to read about. So that's my number 9. My number 8 recommendation to talk about is if you love super hard sci-fi. This is not science fiction that has aliens. This is not science fiction that has crazy interstellar space travel and hyperspeed and light speed and all this stuff. No. This is a truly science fiction story that is deeply rooted in modern technology. And that is the book The Dabaray Snake Launcher by Joel Presby. This book does a great job of showing how sci-fi can still take real-world stuff and just change it a little bit. Joel Presby has talked about how all of the technology discussed in this book is real except for one very small element. It's actually about the thickness of a fiber talked about in this that she had to fudge for the book, but we're actually working on thickening the fiber or artificially doing that so that we can use it. So the technology in this book's not far off from what we could use theoretically, kind of like The Martian did that a little bit. But this is about building a launcher that's basically a space elevator that would allow us to easily shoot things into space, potentially specifically to the moon, so that we could start building the next element of space travel there. And it's set in an alternate history Africa, where Africa became a huge financial powerhouse as opposed to one of the more poorer continents. And so as a result, almost all the characters are Africans from different African tribes. There's a little bit of, if you kind of like the TV show Succession, there's kind of a light version, although without the swearing, but there's a light version of like the Succession type storyline among the people of this wealthy African tribe. And of course, you get the very hard sci-fi elements. The craziest stuff in this book is the alternate history as opposed to the like the technology, which is pretty sound. And I am, for one, hoping that Joelle Presby gets more books in this universe because she's just so fascinating. My next recommendation is a totally flip side of storytelling. This is if you like space opera and Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is an incredible multi-character political epic set in a fantasy world, and a lot of people have been trying to replicate that idea in science fiction. And there are some that have gotten it, apparently, that I haven't read. But of the ones I've read, there is one that I think works very well. The person who has gotten that political, multi-character, huge cast storytelling that is set this time in space with aliens, but still has that kind of Game of Thronesiness to it. And I think that book series is The Saga of the Seven Sons by Kevin J. Anderson. He calls this his magnum opus because it's a 7-book series. It's epic. It's huge. It's one of his better-selling book series. And this book series has great political stuff. It has great action sequences, great romances, great character journeys, despite the fact that this is one of the least character-driven series you'd ever read, because it's very fast-paced. Chapters only a couple pages long. There's hundreds of chapters per book, and you're really just jumping around advancing the plot. But when you look at it as a whole, you see the journey that these characters go on, and it's just a fascinating read. And I think if you like Game of Thrones stuff, you'll enjoy this. And unlike Game of Thrones, this is completed, and the ending's pretty good. So that's that recommendation. What are we at? We're at my number 6. My number 6 is if you love cheesy movies like Willow. Now, Willow, I think, is a wonderful fantasy movie, but it feels cheesy. That's the weird thing about Willow. It feels cheesy even though it's a well-produced film. And I feel the same way about this book that I'm going to talk about. It is a well-produced book, but it is absolutely cheesy. And that is The Golden Queen by Dave Wolverton. It's not cheesy because the cover's cheesy, which the cover is very cheesy and kind of invokes that kind of Willow storytelling, but the world building and the style and the storytelling that happens here does feel very cheesy. It's not funny, but you're kind of like, that's kind of humorous that you would go there in this type of a book. You would think this book came out in the 70s or 80s when really it came out in the mid-90s. So I would say that if you enjoyed the movie Willow and you want the sci-fi version of that, I think that The Golden Queen is a good place to start. It's a trilogy. The second book's not great, but the third book's really entertaining. So the next recommendation I have is if you love the TV show For All Mankind. This kind of gets into that kind of hard sci-fi alternate history stuff. If you like reading about what the space program would have been like if we had tweaked some stuff. Whereas For All Mankind starts in 1969 and just says the Russians get there instead of we get there to the moon in 1969. This next book I'm going to talk about moves the timeline up. And so we have The Calculating Stars, which takes place starts in the 50s, and the series goes on into the 60s. But it is about an alternate history where a meteor hits Earth, so we have to accelerate the space program so that we can get off of Earth before it, the climate goes crazy. And as a result, women start being more involved in the space program, which is why this series is called the Lady Astronaut series. And in this book in particular, you see the start of this happening, and you see the groundwork laid so that the space program can flourish. So that's my number 5. My number 4 on my recommendations list is if you love puzzle box storytelling. People like J.J. Abrams are particularly known for this type of storytelling, but puzzle box storytelling is kind of controversial. Some people really find it fascinating and some people really hate it. I think that it works well if it is executed well, which is why there are some movies that I'm like, yeah, that was great puzzle box storytelling, and some movies where I'm like, are you kidding me? One book where I think puzzle box storytelling really works in its favor is a series called the Icarus series by Timothy Zahn, the first book being The Icarus Hunt. Now, Timothy Zahn wrote The Icarus Hunt back in 1998, I believe, and it was really popular. It's one of his best-selling books outside of Star Wars. I would say it's his most known book outside of Star Wars. The fans love it, and Timothy Zahn has even said at times it's one of his favorites. And it's totally a puzzle box book. And he just recently, back last year in 2022, released a sequel and then has had a contract with Baen Books to write at least 3 more. So the series should have, at minimum, 5 books when he's done. And the second book also is great puzzle box storytelling, as is the first book, although the first book has a fantastic twist at the end that you would, I very much doubt you'll see coming. The second book has some great twists too, but the twist at the end of the first book is shocking. And it has a good cast of characters and good aliens and all that kind of stuff. So if you like puzzle box storytelling, read the Icarus series. Now, what if you like some classic literature in the form of Horatio Hornblower? You like that kind of, you're at sea, you like reading about the military ranks and stuff, you like reading about what mutiny is like, and you like reading about strategy and all that stuff, but you also want great character stuff. You want to see great character added to that. I loved the Horatio Hornblower series as a kid, and I think that affected me when I was reading the Honor Harrington series by David Weber. This book, I think, is the best book of the series that I've read so far. I've read the first 5 books. This is book number 4, Field of Dishonor. But David Weber just knows how to write military sci-fi and make you feel for these characters or hate the characters, or also makes you really enjoy the plots and really start to understand the world building, which I think is really great. So if you like Horatio Hornblower, you'll enjoy this. And I can't say Horatio Hornblower without thinking of the Andy Griffith joke where they're talking about a ratio, and he says, poor old Horatio. Anyway, shout out if you understood that joke. But the next book I'm going to talk about, the next comparison is if you love the Avatar series by James Cameron. No, not the people with the weird tattoos, not the Last Airbender. I'm talking about the blue people Avatar. If you enjoyed that, which there are people that enjoyed them because boy, has it made a lot of money, then I'm going to recommend the book Manta's Gift, also by Timothy Zahn. This is the last Timothy Zahn book on the list. I know I'm including him a lot, but I've read a lot of his books, and he's just so good. He's the best science fiction author, in my opinion. But this book has so many similarities to Avatar, particularly in the opening sections of the book and in the closing, but it has a great, unique story as well that it tells, and it's a bold story. The Avatar storyline of having humans turn into these kind of bluish aliens that are humanoid, it was a bold story. That was bold. Still kind of, still a little bit safe in some ways because they're still humanoid, but it was bold. This is an even bolder story because it turns a human into a flying manta ray that's flying around Jupiter. I mean, you don't get more bold than that in your storytelling. And so it's really, really excellent stuff. It is tied for first among my favorite science fiction books of all time, which is why I'm recommending it. And finally, my final recommendation is if you like The Martian and For All Mankind together. If you like both of those, if you are someone of both minds, that you enjoy both of them together, I'm going to recommend Mars. I've talked about For All Mankind with The Calculating Stars, but I'm specifically talking about that coupled with The Martian here. This book has some great humor in it, but it's pretty much a serious sci-fi book. It has some great character arcs, some great emotional stuff, some great romance, some great political stuff that kind of both the For All Mankind and The Martian go through. And of course, it's dealing with Mars. And so that's why Mars by Ben Bova I said it's tied with Manta's Gift. These are both my tied #1 favorite science fiction books of all time. In a couple of years, I want to reread both of them so I can determine which one's actually on top. But for right now, it is tied with the Manta's Gift for my favorite book. But I would recommend this, especially if you like The Martian and For All Mankind. So those are my 10 science fiction recommendations. I couldn't get to all the different types of potential items to recommend, but I thought this is a solid list of different varieties. So if you like one of these types of things and you've read the book, do you agree? Or are you interested in reading any of these books now? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. But until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.